where I entered these vastly different states of being that I was like, holy moly, we do not understand consciousness at all. Western culture has reduced the spectrum of consciousness to normal everyday waking consciousness. I suddenly became aware of how much of a problem that is, of how much in neuroscience, when we're doing research, like how much of a problem it is that we only focus on that, because there are so many more dimensions to us being. Those types of experiences are ineffable. Spiritual and mystical and psychedelic, they're ineffable, which means they're very difficult to put into words, because the way that I describe it is like you go from your 2D reality into 3D reality, and then you come back to 2D, and then you're trying to explain to people in 2D that the circle is not just a circle, it's a sphere.
Hi everybody, this is Mind the Shift and I'm Anders. Today we will once again dive into one of the biggest topics of this podcast and possibly one of the crucial topics for humanity as we evolve, bridging science and spirituality. So I am thrilled to introduce you to Mona Sobhani. Welcome to the show, Mona.
Hi, thanks so much for having me.
Now you're a cognitive neuroscientist, a researcher, and an author. And I would just read, I'll just read some of what you write about yourself on your website. You say there that you have always been interested in how science and technology intersect with society, and you've explored this theme through researching cognitive neuroscience and law and neuroscience and in digital health. And recently, you have become interested in consciousness, transformative technology, and exploring how science and spirituality can be bridged together. And because of that latter interest, you wrote a book that was released a couple of years ago. Was it in 2021?
It was last year, actually, 2022.
Last year. Okay, so pretty recently. And it's called Proof of Spiritual Phenomena. I have it here on my... I don't know if you can see it.
There you go.
Yeah. And I think I've read it, obviously, and I think it's groundbreaking. I mean, I can't even begin to express how valuable this effort of yours is, because, I mean, it may not contain very much that is very new to people who have, been interested in spiritual matters for a long, long time, but it doesn't really matter, because you kind of cover it all. And the fact that you have made this journey from hardcore materialism to having a completely open mind towards all things spiritual is priceless, I think. I think every skeptic should read this book, and it should be compulsory reading in every science course. And your book really shows that this shift is possible for an intelligent, intellectual, fully functioning and successful Western academic. But you have to tell me one thing. I can't really understand how you were able to go through this transformation in such a brief period of time, because you began this journey in 2018 or something? I mean, that's like yesterday to me.
Yeah, well, it feels like it was an eternity. It did start in 2018. Well, I'm a pretty intense person, and when I get interested in something or it captures my curiosity, then it becomes all-consuming, and that's what happened with this topic, that I just got super curious, and then obsessed is really the correct word. So, turned all my free time and attention into consuming as much as I could on the topic, like reading books and papers and listening to podcasts, and then reaching out to people and speaking to them myself and doing interviews. So it was a lot all at once in a very condensed amount. Like, actually, it started in 2018, and I think I finished writing the book in early 2021. So it was a few years of reading and integrating and interviewing. But yeah, it started casual, and then once it had my attention, it became my full-time, like any free time that I had, it became my full-time job. And I think the COVID, lockdown and quarantine helped because I was forced to be home and I had all that extra time to focus on this.
Yeah. What if everyone who were in lockdown, who was in lockdown, would have utilized that time in that way? I mean, we would have had so many fascinating books and maybe new studies and everything. Would have been great now. Maybe we have. I don't know.
Yeah, maybe they're
Maybe
forthcoming. We'll see.
there will come out so many more books and studies now after this period. We'll see. But I don't know if you're familiar with people like Richard Rudd, Eckhart Tolle, Angelo Di Lullo. I'm sure Eckhart Tolle is familiar to you. But
yes, yeah.
These guys, these persons, these people, they had all had spiritual awakenings either spontaneously or after some initial effort. Mm-hmm. And it took all of these people between 10 and 20 years to finally be able to explain in a book what they had realized. But I'm not saying that you have had a spiritual awakening of the same kind as they have, but it seems as some kind of awakening in a way. But you seem to have documented your journey almost in real time as you went along.
Yeah, that's what I wanted to do. I found that there was a lot of research around these things, but what I didn't find a lot of were, like, I found a lot of books that summarized research or had theories, but what I wasn't finding, and I guess what I needed, was someone's personal story of how they were dealing with a worldview flip. And since I didn't find that, I just decided to write it myself, because I was thinking, like you said, there's not, I didn't do any research myself. I didn't want to. I wanted to, just like I do for neuroscience, which used to be my day job, we search the scientific literature, and a lot of times we have reviews or meta-analyses or summaries of the state of science in some particular field. And we look to that for, like a summary of what's going on. And so I kind of wanted to focus on those things instead of, trying to find new information that was more controversial. So in science, we build on each other's work. And then when you have like a summary of something, that's a good idea. That's how you get a good sense of what's going on in the field. And I thought, I didn't think that existed, in this field, but it did. And so I was happy to find those. And I thought, oh, this is great. And so I could include them in the in the book. But I wanted to also capture my reaction to it, because that's what I found was missing from a lot of the other books that I had read, and I was having so much trouble with it. Like, flipping a worldview is not easy. It was really difficult. And so I thought, well, I might as well document. And actually, that was some of the feedback I got from early drafts of the book. I think early drafts were a little more, I always had my story in there, but they were a little more focused on the evidence or the papers. And then I had friends tell me, like, it would be nice to hear how these findings influenced your life and your journey, or as you came to accept things, like, how did that impact you? So then I started including more of that in the book.
That was good advice, I think.
Yeah.
Because I think that's one of the things that are so valuable with this book, that you actually describe this flip, as you say. Actually, there is a book called The Flip. I think you mentioned it in the book.
Yeah.
Which is, I haven't read it myself, but I think it's more or less similar in a way.
Well, it's written by Jeff Kripal, who's a professor at Rice University. He's the chair of religious thought and philosophy there. And he's been writing about these phenomena from a comparative religion standpoint for his entire career. And he wrote this book called The Flip in 2019 about scientists who have flipped. And he talks about how it takes a personal encounter with the impossible, he calls it, for a scientist to flip. And then the book contains a few stories of I don't know if quote unquote famous,
so
but
it's not a
popular
story
stories
about his own flip, so to speak. But
no, it's not his personal. It's
so it should be
compilation.
called the Flips, really.
Yes, yeah.
Okay. Fascinating. Well, you mentioned so many books in your book. It's as I say, it's very difficult to find anything that you haven't covered in this area. I will try to I will try to ask you about a few things that I didn't find there. But anyway, you talk about I think already on page 1 you talk about old me and new me, which is nice, I think, because that speaks volumes about what you've gone through here. So how different are you now after just, 3-4 years of researching into this, diving into the spiritual realm? Do other people notice change in you?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I became much more open-minded. I mean, I think that coming from like a standard Western scientific worldview, even though scientists tend to know that we don't know everything, and we know that there's limits to science, but we get kind of comfortable in our authority and our expertise, and we have confidence in our worldview. I think obviously I don't want to speak on behalf of all scientists, but that's how I felt. And I think that as I was encountering all these classes of, evidence, whether it's empirical or scientific in varying degrees, I think that I just started to, I had an ego struggle. That's where that part comes in. Like, it was not easy. I'm going to make it sound like it was easy, but it wasn't easy. But I had this,
ego death is never easy.
Yeah, to like let go of this box. Like, basically I think of it as like a perception box or like a box of beliefs that we create, that we stay within. And whenever things come in that don't match you just kind of ignore it. And that's the way the human mind is built. Sometimes if someone says something that you're not familiar with, it kind of just bounces off. It takes because it takes a lot of energy, like brain energy, to pay attention, to recognize that you don't understand that. And then it takes curiosity to go explore. But that takes a lot of energy, and people don't usually have time for that. So I had gotten comfortable, in my box. But I think after continuously, and that was the other thing, was like I would keep encountering new levels. There'd be new levels of things that were impossible or that I couldn't believe. Like, my mind was being blown constantly with each new interview, to the point where I just was like, oh, I can't keep expanding I can keep expanding the box, but I was kind of like, I just want to let go of the box totally and just say, we don't know. And kind of make those boundaries more loose and more open, so that when people say things to me, like I say, old me would have been very judgmental. So if someone was talking about some spiritual experience they had or something, I would immediately be like, oh, that was probably just
hallucination or something.
You were hungry. Yeah, you didn't drink enough water. Your electricity flickered, whatever, some standard explanation. But then new me would just, I just try to listen with curiosity about what is it in this person's experience that makes them, that had such a profound effect on them, that convinced them that this thing that happened to them was real. Like, what is the meaning it has for them? And just kind of being curious about it. So I think I try to be anyway. It's an exercise and a practice to be open-minded and just, listen with a little more compassion, because I think that we tend to immediately just judge and shut down. Definitely that's what I used to do. And I started realizing that, in fact, that doesn't really serve me, and it doesn't really serve the person who's telling me the story. And, it's just not the best use of our interaction with each other. So, and by shutting down, it just served that purpose of, I want to stay in my box, and I don't want your information to widen my box. So, I ignore it. But yeah, so new me was more like, oh, let me just listen.
Yeah, I think that's so good that you've ended up there in that place. I mean, it's kind of sad, really, that so many of us. I mean, your old you was very, representative of all the whole scientific community, or the community in general. I would say the society in general, that people are kind of used to thinking of the scientific, the Western scientific model as the truth. And if somebody's telling you something that's way out of that box, as you say, then you kind of, many people kind of see it as a good thing to either ignore it or to reject it. But it's really very arrogant, isn't it? I mean, phenomenologically, everybody has their own experience of things, and you should really respect every person's experience of anything, really.
Yeah, and that's true. I mean, one of the core, problems in neuroscience is consciousness, which we define as, like our experiences of being ourselves. Like I have no idea what it's like to be you, and you don't know what it's like to be me, right? And each person, their experience of themselves and their experience of life and reality is unique to each person. And even in neuroscience or psychology, we have no way of measuring that. So, you really do have to take people at their word. And somebody did a really good, this philosopher I follow did this really nice presentation recently about this, about how Western culture has narrowed the spectrum of consciousness that's acceptable. And so in the past, like indigenous cultures and all kinds of cultures all around the world throughout the history of humanity have used trance states, like drumming or chanting or singing or humming or meditating to these are like altered states of consciousness to have other types of experiences, right? Other types of human experiences. But Western culture has like narrowed that spectrum to like just ordinary daytime or whatever, like awaking consciousness is the only acceptable one that we use for acquiring knowledge or verifying things. But it hasn't been like that for the majority of human history. And that's just that's just how it is right now, but it hasn't been like that. And it's not like that in many cultures. So I think bringing that perspective in really helps you kind of understand why we are where we are.
Is there still anything in this spiritual realm, or whatever you want to call it, the non-physical realm, that you still balk a little bit when you hear about, that you still feel that, oh no, I'm not going to go there, that's too woo-woo?
I mean, I don't really not really. I
Tough
mean,
question.
I'll listen to anything. I'm not an expert on everything. I don't read about, for example, I mean, I don't even know, like maybe, I'm not super interested in UFOs, for example, even though I know that that's coming out, but I'm aware that it's because of the people I interviewed for my book. I'm aware that that's actually related to consciousness. In the past, I was really not interested. I was, when I was interviewing people for the book and they would bring up UFOs, I'd be like, please stop. I'm not interested. I will zone out of this conversation if you start talking about aliens. But then, these were scientists that I was speaking to, and they were saying like, well, we think there's a component of consciousness. And so, I mean, I looked into it and it was interesting, but I wouldn't say I spend a huge amount of time on it. Yeah, I mean, I listen and read everything just because I think genuinely it's hard for me to now imagine that people are making up these stories, because you just see such consilience across cultures, across time, that even, and I think we just get too caught up too in the definition of real because of our worldview, which is that reality is made of physical matter and everything's physical and only physical things are real. And I just think that's where the problem comes in conversations with people, where it's like you're not even speaking the same language. To me, it started with that. I was like, what's real, what's not? I want the mechanism. What's the science? And then after digging into this for a while, you start to realize that it's not that simple. And when you start to think of it from a consciousness perspective, you're like, what someone perceives is real to them. What else is there? Our consciousness is our reality. It's the beginning, the middle, and the end. That's it. So you kind of, you can't really tell somebody that they didn't experience something, even though we do that all the time. So I think for me, that's where the part of the flip happened was, I can't tell you that what you experienced isn't real. Nobody can. So it's
That's
bringing
fascinating.
the curiosity to that, instead of saying, is what you experienced real or not? It was real to you. So you have to kind of start there.
Yeah. I mean, so many philosophers and also scientists these days are talking about reality in this way. I mean, more and more. It's still not the mainstream, of course, as your book is pointing out very eloquently. But this is what you just described is what, as far as I understand, what could be called idealism. Would you say that you're an idealist? That which meaning that consciousness is primary and everything arises from consciousness. So matter is secondary. Matter is an expression of consciousness. Are you there or?
Yeah, I mean, I try not to box myself in anymore, but I do think that I think probably consciousness is fundamental. And I think some people get nitpicky about that and they'll be like, well, how do you define consciousness? And it's like, give me a break. No one knows. Okay. So, I mean, I don't know. It's some type of energy, some type of information. Like I don't know what it is, but I do think that that kind of model accounts for more classes of impossible or anomalous phenomena than does a materialist physicalist paradigm. So and that's actually what Jeff Kripal says in that book, The Flip, and in a lot of his other writings, is that you have to ignore so much evidence to make the materialist physicalist paradigm work. But if you can't account for data points in a model, then it's not a very good model. And so, I mean, that's how I come to my conclusion, or I try not to conclude. I'm still exploring, but I just know that that model cannot account for a lot of experiences. So, I look at other models that do account for those.
Yeah, we'll get back to the science and the bridging of science and spirituality in a few minutes here. But I want to rewind a little bit to your journey here, your personal story, before we delve into the the science and the esoteric questions here. You were a devoted physicalist before this journey started, but as it turns out, and you tell this in the book, you had some experience of quote unquote unexplicable or unexplainable phenomena, among them readings in coffee grounds. So tell us about that.
Yeah, so I'm Persian by heritage. My my grandparents are from Iran, and in our culture, we can use a lot of different things for divination. But in our family, my grandmother would use coffee grounds. It's not like American coffee grounds. It's like a thicker coffee that you leave the grounds in the cup, and when it dries, it forms pictures. And if you have a reader or an intuitive, they can look at the pictures and intuit things about your past, present, and future. And my grandmother could do it, and my mom does it still. And my mom would do readings for people at our family parties and stuff. And then she would do it for me when I was in graduate school. And I didn't believe in it. I just, I ignored it. But she would read for me, and then I started taking notes. And I noticed that she was more right than she was wrong. And, so if she warned me, don't make sure you pay your bills, or it looks like you might lose money, be careful not to, like, I would take it seriously because she would usually right. And so I couldn't explain it with science. I definitely couldn't explain it with reductionist material science, because it's like coffee grounds in a cup. Like, how could that possibly mean anything? Like, even stepping into my shoes, it's like, it's laughable from a materialist perspective.
Yeah.
Or the closest thing, the closest explanation would be that that person subconscious has picked up things about you and your life, and that in looking at the pictures, it evokes things that coincidentally turn out to be true. But the things that my mom would say would be months in advance, and they would be things that I wouldn't know were coming, that she would have no way of knowing, like things at work that were outside of both of our, you know what I mean? It was things that there's no way that she could know, that, or that I could know. So, and it took many years to take it seriously. But after a while, I was like, you know what? I don't know how it works, but it works. And I just lived in cognitive dissonance with that.
Like many people do, I think.
Yeah, it's true. Everyone has their superstitions. I was just at a conference, a psychedelics conference last week, the MAPS one in Denver, and I was speaking to a physician, and we were talking about this, and he said, he's like, I always say I'm an atheist and I'm a materialist. He's like, but I partake in my cultural, rituals and our traditions. And he's like, and I am kind of superstitious, he's like, I'll knock on wood or whatever. And he's like, so if I really want to be honest, he's like, I'm not. Like, my behavior suggests that I actually believe in something more. He's like, but it's just my mind that wants to say that I don't. And I was like, well, that's great. That takes a lot of self-awareness to be aware of that. But
That's true. Yeah,
yeah,
that's really honest, and it's so fascinating because I mean, this is actually what's going on. We are like, it's like Eckhart Tolle said when after he had his awakening, that he suddenly realized that there were kind of two people inside here, or wherever it is. I don't think it's in the brain, but I
right.
don't think you do either. But it's like we do some things and we tell people some things, and we have this facade, but then there's all this other conversation going on somewhere inside us, which contradicts often what we do and say. And it's not everybody has this, and
Yes.
we don't even, I mean, reflect upon it, because but it's actually some kind of, I don't know if you could say evidence, but it's an indication that there is something more than just this one physical expression of ourselves.
Yeah, and I think we see in some schools of thought in psychology and definitely in neuroscience experiments, you do see that there are actually many personalities or many aspects of ourselves. So we think of ourselves as one personality, but it's not true. Like, even in neuroscience, when they used to do these experiments where they would cut the neurons that connect the two hemispheres of the brain, the corpus callosum, and you see two totally different personalities in the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere, like completely different people, like different favorite colors, different preferences for room temperature, different handwriting.
Mhm.
Like, so there really is we are way more multifaceted than we're aware of, even from a biological materialist perspective. But bringing in that spiritual perspective too, like during my own journey, I remember that when I started digging into all of these weird topics, I remember my ego was flipping out and was like, oh no, I'm like the type of person who's like reading about reincarnation, like, oh, I'm so ashamed. But then my, soul or whatever, like another part of me was like excited and happy to be reading about it because I was curious about it. So I was feeding that curiosity and I was having fun. And it was like, I was more, energized than I had been in a long time. And so I got to observe that difference of like, oh, I thought that my, ego and personality was my whole thing, but she's upset. But then this other part of me is really happy to to have found these interesting topics and to be reading and learning about it. So yeah, there's a lot of different parts of ourselves, I think. And
Yeah. And I
it's just
mean, most of
interesting.
us realize that, I mean, we don't call ourselves schizophrenics because that's what you would, that
Mm-hmm.
conclusion, you would draw that conclusion if you have a very simple-minded view of what a person is, if you realize that you have several different personalities within you. But I mean, yeah, sorry, just to
Yeah, we tend to
sidetrack.
integrate and um, switch between them seamlessly. So
Yeah.
yeah.
So, well, anyway, you had this, your mother did these readings in coffee grounds, and then cut a long story short, I guess,
Oh yes.
as far as I understand, you had this, you went through this proverbial dark night of the soul when a relationship ended, and was what triggered your transformation. Is that correct?
Well, I was already having an existential crisis, sort of. I was already kind of, by the time I finished graduate school, I was. They train you that the universe is random, dead, and meaningless. That any meaning that you create comes from your brain. That your brain is a coincidence detector, so it looks for coincidence and it creates stories and creates meaning. So all meaning comes from you. So any sense of like a magical, enchanted universe I may have had before graduate school was definitely stamped out by the end of it. And then I, entered the working world. And I kind of had this existential crisis of like, oh my God, is this what we do forever until we die? And so I was already in a weird existential place. And then actually, my mom had seen uh, a death in the years before the breakup, in the coffee. And I tell that story in the book, but that was a crucial turning point. I didn't do anything at that point, but it shook me. It shook my foundation of my understanding of reality, because up to that point, everything from the coffee grounds had just been like, don't lose money, or you might switch offices, or, whatever, little things. But this was life or death. And so it really shook me, because it was like 6 weeks, 7 weeks in advance. She warned me, and I couldn't understand how the information of someone's death could, come travel in like through these, like it disturbed me, but I didn't do anything. And then 2 years, I think 2 years later, yeah, this relationship ended, but I already had all this other stuff going on in the background. So that was just the final, like I had already
Okay.
lost the other legs of the stool, and then that was just the last one. Yeah, and then
Yeah.
I had a dark night, because then I felt like I didn't understand the universe that we live in, or what the point of all of this was. Um,
But how
so it
could
was
you
just
muster the energy being in that state? How could you muster the energy to decide to start writing a book? I mean, that takes a lot of energy and effort.
that didn't happen until, let's see,
Until you came out of it a little bit, maybe?
yeah, until I came out of it a little bit. It took a few months, and then my I think what happened was, oh yeah, my
You went to other
friends,
intuitive readers, right?
yeah, my girlfriends in Los Angeles were like, let's, we're in LA, so there's a lot of psychics and intuitives, and they had gone, they knew some good ones, so they were like, let's go. It'll apparently it was a thing my friends would do when they were going through something difficult. They would go see a intuitive. So I went with them, and then the lady's reading blew me away. She knew things, like really detailed things that were like said, like things there's no freaking way she could know. So she blew my socks off, and then I got curious, and then
Can you tell details about that, or is it too personal? I mean, you don't have to. I mean,
I mean, I have to try to remember. I mean, for one thing, she mentioned like a past trauma from my childhood, that like somebody was hurt, another child was hurt, and anyway, and she got the body part right, and then she got the like city that they moved to afterward, right? The city, I mean, like, who
I mean,
even
that's pretty detailed.
yeah, like
Yeah.
the city in America of all the cities, like it was, and it wasn't in California, so it wasn't like a local guess. I mean, so it was things like that that I was just, I think I just kept saying like, "How did you know that? How did you know?" Because I didn't believe in it at that time, so I was just like, "How is this lady doing this?" But then that made me curious, and so we went to a few more readings, and then I was like, what if we swap readings? Will they make sense for each of us? Because if they're vague or general, like people say, we should be able to swap them. But they weren't. They were very specific to each of us in our lives. And so I thought there was something there, but I still didn't. That was months and months in the making, and I didn't do anything. I wasn't listening to anything spiritual at that point. I was just kind of like existing barely. And then I think it was this podcast episode that I serendipitously heard. Like I was reading Chelsea Handler, she's a comedian in the US. I was reading her book, and she had a podcast episode where she had a psychic medium on, Laura Lynn Jackson, and Chelsea Handler at the time was a skeptic. So I was like, why does she have a psychic medium on? And then the psychic medium started talking about a spiritual framework, that like reincarnation and soul lessons, that I had heard in the intuitive readings from the ones I went to, but that had gone over my head because I didn't know what that meant. I had no familiarity at all with spiritual framework. So when they had said in the readings, I just ignored it. But I had written it down. And then when I heard her interview, I was like, oh, is this a thing people believe in? And then she mentioned that she had her brain measured. Like she had been in neuroscience studies to measure her reading states. So of course that got my attention, because I was like, what? Who did this research? Where's the published paper? And then so that sparked my actual scientific interest. And then they also mentioned a book called Many Lives, Many Masters by Brian Weiss
Oh
on
yeah.
the
Mm.
podcast episode. And so I ordered that because they said it was a psychiatrist case study. I didn't know it was about past life regression. So when it arrived and I started reading it, I was pretty surprised. But that whole podcast episode and that book were kind of the tipping point of, I was like, I think that scientists and doctors are interested in this. And, that was kind of my permission slip to get curious about it.
It's so fascinating and wonderful. I think I might be wrong, but I think I have that book by Brian Weiss in my shelf, one of my shelves here.
It's a short, easy read.
Yeah, I think if I have read it, I think I've read it. Must have been 25 years ago or something. I mean, I've been into this. I've been not very much into it, but I've been interested in this since I was a kid, really. And so it's so fascinating that all these terms and this terminology, this spiritual terminology that you talk about in the book, that it was all new to you just 3-4 years ago. And now you've written a book about it. And I mean, I've heard about these things since, 40 years back? And I haven't written a book about it as yet. I might do, because I get inspired by what you've done here. But anyway.
You should.
Yeah, maybe at one point. I'll think about it. So let's dive a little bit into the esoteric stuff and the combo spirituality and science, which is, there is no real border, is there? If you look at it deeply, which you have done. I sometimes think of these phenomena, like if you use Occam's razor, this scientific philosophical tool that basically means that the simplest explanation is often the correct one. You don't have to have any cumbersome and meticulous theories around it, but the simplest and most intuitive explanation is often the correct one. And many times a non-physical explanation or an intuitive explanation is the simplest and the most straightforward one to explain some kind of spiritual phenomenon. But it's like in the conventional scientific community or realm, it's like the burden of evidence is somehow sneakily turned around. It's like they say, you must prove this with our scientific tools. Would you agree that this is how it works?
Yeah, I think that scientists, they want to you want to have equal footing, I guess, to compare evidence. So they're looking for, it's sort of like, the worldview dictates what you consider acceptable evidence. So since they're coming from a materialist, physicalist worldview, physical evidence that we can measure on something or somehow is usually the metric, that's considered good evidence. That's just the way it is. And even not even looking at spiritual stuff, even in neuroscience and psychology, a person's, we call it subjective report of something, is not as trustworthy as like brain data that we're recording with an MRI machine. But the kind of like catch-22 around that is that, again, subjective experience is all we have. And the only way we can't measure someone else's subjective experience. So their self-report is all we ever have. And like brain data is meaningless without understanding what the person is experiencing.
Yeah.
So that's why they want that. But
yeah, but it's like, well, it comes down to the issue of consciousness, I guess, especially in your field, neuroscience, because consciousness is what people are researching or studying in that field without actually maybe thinking about it all the time. That's what they're doing. But it's a good example. You're talking about the catch-22 here, which I think is exactly right, because and I talked about the reversal of the burden of evidence here, and it's really almost a comically salient example when you talk about the hard problem of consciousness, because the simplest explanation using Occam's razor is that consciousness isn't physical, because everybody can. If you go into yourself, if you don't even have to meditate, but if you do that, you can sense that there is something. You don't even know. You can't even pinpoint exactly where you are, and there isn't even any you. It's just an existence. It's just an awareness, and it's there. And it's like but these scientists, they're kind of cutting up brains and measuring neurons firing and trying to pinpoint exactly where is this happening, where is it produced. But it's like, I don't know, it's they will never find it, because it's I mean, the burden of evidence is turned the wrong way. Why do they even try? I mean, and also, how is it possible that neuroscientists aren't pondering, or maybe they are pondering, the hard problem of consciousness every day in their work?
Most of them are not, because it's almost impossible to do your work if you're stuck on the hard problem, because you can't really get around it. But there are neuroscientists who are focused on the problem of consciousness. And, there's a few different models proposed, a few leading theories in mainstream science. And I've seen lately in scientific journals, actually, more and more, I've seen a few of these models published recently, which I think is we're seeing the paradigm shift a little bit, because I'm seeing models proposed that are moving away from exactly how do the neurons firing and connecting with each other produce consciousness. Like, that's the usual question. And I'm seeing theory, like I included one in my book, but that's not the only one that I've seen lately. There's a few that say, okay, what if consciousness is an energy field? Let's say it's the electromagnetic energy field, and it runs through everything, and that the interaction of the field with our biological brain somehow, filters it through. I've seen other models that say the interaction of the field with the brain, the actual interaction is consciousness. I've seen like multiple different models. So, I mean, the truth is no one knows, but I do think you're seeing now an expansion of the models moving past just the brain. I mean, are those mainstream theories? I think not yet, but it doesn't matter.
We're getting there. It
They're
sounds
still,
promising.
yeah, they're still being published. And I mean, this year I'm helping organize a panel at the Society for Neuroscience, which is our big annual conference every year. So, for alternative models of consciousness. So we'll see.
Yeah. So, is this enigma of consciousness what captures your attention the most in this intersection between science and spirituality, or are there other areas?
It's a good question. I mean, I think that when I started being interested in this stuff, I do think, actually, no, I was actually very resistant. I don't like I used to not like the topic of consciousness. Before any of this stuff happened to me as a neuroscientist, if you mentioned consciousness to me, it was on the same level as UFOs, where I was like, that is too philosophical. Get it away from me. I don't care. It's too hard. We don't have an answer. It's too philosophical. It's just a philosophical problem that we cannot get around. And so I just wasn't interested in it. And it was only through this whole experience that I started to be interested in consciousness, and honestly, through my own experiences, like through meditation or breath work or psychedelics, where I entered these vastly different states of being that I was like, holy moly, we do not understand consciousness at all. Like the how I mentioned earlier, how Western culture has reduced the spectrum of consciousness to normal everyday waking consciousness. I suddenly became aware of how much of a problem that is, of how much in neuroscience, when we're doing research, like how much of a problem it is that we only focus on that, because there are so many more dimensions to us being. And it's hard to put into words, because those types of experiences are ineffable. Spiritual and mystical and psychedelic, they're ineffable, which means they're very difficult to put into words, because there's just no words to explain it. I mean, the way that I describe it is like you go from your 2D reality into 3D reality, and then you come back to 2D, and then you're trying to explain to people in 2D that the circle is not just a circle, it's a sphere. and
Yeah.
but they can't picture it if they haven't experienced it. And so I think that I think that I became more interested in the philosophies and the implications of those philosophies through personal experience. Because without that, it's still just philosophical. And I don't know, I'm just not that interested in philosophy personally. But through the experiences, I was like, what did I just experience? Oh my God, I'm so much greater. My consciousness is so much greater. There's so many different ways to interact with reality,
Mm.
like that
You
kind
took
of
an
thing opens
LSD
up to
trip, did
you.
you, or what was it?
Yeah, LSD. Yes, psilocybin. I mean, a few
Also,
different
okay.
ones. I mean,
Mm.
even MDMA, right, is like expands your emotional landscape in
Mm.
such a vastly different way. Like you didn't even know you could feel the range of emotions. Again, it's like going from 2D emotions to 3D emotions.
Mm.
And you just can't believe that you live such a limited, like
Mm.
everyday reality. So
Mm.
I think, yeah, because of those experiences, but you don't have to do drugs, obviously. You can achieve all those states through breath work or meditation. But um, slipping into those states, I think, makes you much more interested in the philosophical, like, panpsychism or idealism or or
Yeah.
whatever it is, cosmopsychism. Like they just
And
become more
and
interesting.
psychedelics are slowly becoming more and more accepted again, as they were in the 50s before they were all banned
Mhm.
as narcotics. But now they're slowly becoming accepted again as like medical treatments for people with PTSD, for instance, or
Yeah.
I mean all kinds of
Yes.
stuff. And I think that's also a promising sign, I guess.
Yeah. I think it's great. I do think there's going to be, I think there's some dangers there too, but we'll see. I think I like psychedelics and altered states because they're the intersection of like science, spirituality, like and the human experience just as a whole. They're this nice, they're, and oh, I was going to say the other thing, so philosophy to me is interesting to sit around, and think about, but I do like to focus on what's practical and what can improve my day-to-day everyday living. And I think experiencing those altered states, I think does help. I think spirituality enhances like, my personal interaction with everyday reality, day-to-day living. So I'm actually like, I know some people really like to focus on the philosophy, and I'm happy to think about it and talk about it. But I really think, it's like what's useful for people in their everyday, day to day living.
Yeah.
If it helps you, like if it relieves your suffering to understand that everything is conscious, then that's beautiful. But if it doesn't, then who cares?
Well, it's a wonderful endeavor. I mean, everybody can't be a philosopher. That wouldn't work. 8 billion philosophers wouldn't work.
No, definitely not.
So I'm happy that some people want to do
Right.
the hard work or the practical work, the practical stuff.
Yeah, I
So
agree.
how known and how accepted is it among scientists, neuroscientists in particular, that when you take psychedelics, the brain actually is not exactly turned off, but its activity diminishes significantly. And because I think it was a study back in 2012 that found this for the first time.
Mhm.
I think it's been replicated after that, because before that everybody assumed that the brain would be lit up like a Christmas tree when you took psychedelics,
That's right.
because people had these amazing experiences. But it's the other way around, isn't it? And how known is that, and how accepted is that?
That's a good question. I mean, for people who pay attention to psychedelic neuroscience, I think it's pretty well known, but I don't think that everybody pays attention to that yet. I don't know how widely known it is, honestly. But although I've had a lot
I
of
mean,
people ask
it's
me,
crucial, isn't it? It's very crucial for the understanding of the brain, what the brain does and what the brain is, and what it produces and
yeah,
what it doesn't produce.
yeah, and they're continuing to do neuroimaging studies. And I mean, I think the tough thing with neuroimaging, because I used to do this work, so is that it's so noisy. Like the pictures are noisy. You have to run all of these statistics to get anything meaningful, and it's so expensive to run even one patient. That's why all neuroimaging studies always have small populations, because it's so expensive. Like I think it used to be like $500 or $700 per person or something. Like it's so expensive. So the problem with the studies is that we need a lot more. We need so many more studies, so many more people's brains scanned to say anything truly meaningful. But you are right that the evidence that's coming out so far, it shows a few interesting things. One is everyone, because when you're on a psychedelic, it's like the world is sparkling and like everything is alive, that there's so much stimulation that your brain must be firing on all levels. But they found in some of the earlier studies that there was actually reduced activity in certain areas. And I think overall in general, there was reduced activity. I don't know for certain that that's held up across all studies and all substances. That's another thing, is all the substances are different. But I do know that they have found, and again, so much work is needed, but they found that the default mode network, which is the network in the brain that is focused on yourself, it's called default because when you go into default mode, when you're not thinking or not talking to someone, what do? You think about yesterday, what you're going to do in the future. You're basically thinking about yourself usually. So default mode. But they found in experienced meditators, that they can dampen activity in that. And they found that in certain psychedelics too, that activity in that network is dampened, which basically means it takes the focus off of you and expands it outward, or it diminishes the boundary between you and other, which is exactly the experience you have on psychedelics, which is that it's not so clear where I end and you begin, or where I end and the table begins. Like all these boundaries become blurred. And another thing they found is that your brain, gets used to firing in certain patterns, right? And it's like lazy. It takes energy to change those patterns. But what psychedelics do is it breaks open those patterns and allows new connections to be made. So that's why you see people able to change their behavior more easily. That's why psychedelics paired with psychotherapy helps people change and cure, PTSD or cure traumas, because they're able to actually change those circuits much more easily than a psychotherapy alone, or even psychedelics alone. Like together, it works best. So those are a few of the findings that are pretty promising. But yes, I think they need to do a little more work on that. But it was shocking, and it does tie back to some of the theories about broader consciousness. Like Aldous Huxley in his book Doors of Perception proposed that there's a mind at large, like a field of consciousness, and that if our brains filter the field, and like on psychedelics, you open the filter and you can see more. And that's what people got excited about from those initial neuroimaging findings. But yeah, we'll see. I mean, there's a lot I just came from the MAPS conference, and there is so much research being done. It's really exciting.
Yeah.
Huge props to them, because they're moving at an astronomical pace. Those scientists are doing great.
Kudos to them.
Yeah.
So how did we end up here? How do you see the split between science and spirituality, or science and religion, perhaps back in the, I guess it was in the 17th century, more or less? Did we throw out the baby with the bathwater?
Yeah, and I do. I think so. And I think we're seeing in a lot of fields, actually. I've just been connecting with some people from not science, some other fields like finance.
Not science.
Not science, yeah, or spiritual.
Pretty big field.
That, yeah, I mean, there's this thing called the meaning crisis that everyone talks about, that that there's, like I said, like our scientific Western worldview is such that the universe is meaningless. There's no meaning out there. It's up to you to create meaning. It comes from your brain. But I think that people struggle to do that, because in the past, before the Enlightenment, right, we had religion that was like inherited, and you didn't question it, and it gave you meaning and a spiritual structure in your life. And then for good reasons, the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment were like, well, religion is abusing its privileges, and we need to, and they had these discoveries in science that propelled our technology forward. But then we threw it all out the window with this materialist, physicalist worldview. And I think that this discussion of the meaning crisis, with people, the highest levels ever of mental health issues and, really just despair all around, I think it partly, at least partly, is attributable to that people don't have structures of meaning and purpose in their lives anymore. And it's a shame. And I was one of those people, like I talk about in the book. And one of the biggest surprises for me was that spirituality was valuable, right? It was valuable. Like even a simple narrative shift in my mind of, oh, why do we have to live through this horrible life and suffer? Or why do I have to, why, like a victim mentality of like, why is this happening to me? Flipping it around to be like, what lesson am I supposed to be learning? I came here to learn lessons. What am I supposed to be learning? Was like, doesn't seem like it would be, but it was profoundly valuable. Like it changed my whole life experience so drastically.
Such a relief, isn't it?
It really is. You're like, oh, there is a reason. And then it's not just, I'm making it sound like it's a leap of faith, but that's what the whole book was I wanted to believe that narrative. So I went looking for evidence that it could be true because, at least for me, and I think for a lot of people coming from Western culture, it's hard to take leaps of faith without some sort of evidence or something, right? You need something to say that there's more. And that's what I went looking for. And that's what I put in the book, to find that even if we can't definitively prove, we can't definitively prove most things in science. Nothing is proven. We never say prove. Everything's a theory, but there's enough. There's enough to leave the door open for that. Yeah. And I think also, I just want to say this too, in a lot of cosmology and physics, and philosophies, there's an ongoing debate about, like you were saying, whether panpsychism is the ultimate reality, or if it's materialism, or if it's something else. And I think that there's a lot of, evolutionary biology, there's a lot of fields converging on, we probably live in a participatory universe, so whether you consider
that Wheeler said, I think,
spiritual or not. I mean, even more recent, a lot of, there's a ton of philosophers who are kind of converging on, call it spiritual or whatever. Like there's a lot of aspects to it, but in the least, we probably live in a participatory universe. And it does seem like there's some sort of meaning built in, and it's defined in different ways in different cosmologies. But it does seem that multiple, I think, lines of science and philosophy and fields are converging on that, which I think is hopeful, because I do think not one worldview will work for everyone, right?
No, that's true. Very true. Very wise. And many scientists, many traditional scientists, Western scientists, should take heed also. Now, quantum physics is a big thing, and was actually began over 100 years ago, but it's just like the last few years. Quantum physics and quantum mechanics and the quantum field theory have become topical in this context here. Are we perhaps beginning to, by way of these findings, corroborate ancient wisdom that has been there for thousands of years? I've heard references to physicists who now say that space-time is doomed, for instance. I listened to a conversation between Donald Hoffman and Robert Edward Grant yesterday, and it was just fascinating. Donald Hoffman, I think you mentioned him in the book. And,
yes.
He's also a neuroscientist, and he's way into these this thinking of, some kind of a background field or something, and this is just an illusion. Everything is just what we see is a desktop version of what is actually real. Anyway, right. you can answer that if you want.
Yes, Donald Hoffman, the neuroscientist from UC Irvine, he's great. Your question was quantum. Okay.
Quantum physics. Is that going to help us to come back to ancient wisdom and make us realize that the ancient wisdom was actually correct?
Yeah. I said quantum physics is hard, so I'm not a quantum physicist, but I did include it for like a little bit in my book, just a section, and the reason is because, and I can see it from both sides. Some people criticize, they're like, oh, you can't extrapolate quantum effects to larger effects. I mean, that's the whole thing, is we haven't been able to reconcile Newtonian physics with quantum physics. But there's actually, and I included some of it in the book, but there's a lot more research now showing quantum effects under warm biological circumstances that we didn't think were possible. So again, it's like we don't know everything about quantum physics. We're still learning. And I do like to, sometimes I get frustrated with some of the spiritual people who do make the leap, although whatever, what harm is it if it helps people understand? But I do think
it's tempting, when you
yeah, no, and
people are going to listen if you mention quantum physics.
Oh my God, that's true. But I do think there is something there between the parallels, right? So it's like before we had quantum physics, you had all these spiritual texts talk about, whatever, like, oh, in psychedelics, you can feel like you've taken the consciousness of another person or an animal or the table or something, like you become that thing. And I think when we didn't have quantum physics, but then that comes along and suddenly you have entanglement, right? The phenomenon of entanglement, which is that these two widely separated particles are connected and a change in one simultaneously, meaning it's faster than the speed of light, which shouldn't be possible, changes the other. And you have the observer effect, right? That observing something changes the outcome. So we have all of these really interesting, like just pure quantum physics, very scientific findings, where when you just look at the, basically the implications, if you dumb it down to English, simple English sentence, what does this mean? It means this. And then you take that and overlay it onto spiritual texts, and it's like, it matches. And obviously that's not a scientific way of doing things, but we don't, we're humans. And just the fact that it's almost like you've had these spiritual human truths through the history of humanity. And now you finally have a science that shows effects that are explaining these experiences that people have had. So I think maybe we don't have a map from, A to Z of how the human experience maps onto quantum physics yet. But I do think that it shouldn't be totally discounted because, there's a resonance there. But, there's a similarity. And so I think that, I don't know. I mean, there's nothing mapped for sure, but there's new findings every day. And like you said, a lot of physicists they keep saying space-time is doomed. And so, for example, I remember when I started, I had not heard that, and I did not know that when I first got into this spiritual stuff. And I remember all of the intuitives telling me there's no space-time on the other side. And I'd be like, what? What do you mean other side? There's no other side. In my head, I was like, this is reality. But they would say things like, there's no space-time on the other side. I don't know, they would say things that later when I would be reading something purely from physics or cosmology or philosophy, and you would just find that in like a modern day philosopher would say or a physicist would say, well, we're actually, there might be another dimension to our reality where there is no space-time. And then suddenly you're like, oh.
And those readers, they hadn't read those books.
Right. And it's like those readers are not reading like, a physics paper. So I think it's interesting. And I do think that I mentioned it in my book. Like I just think, okay, here's another one that I think is pretty interesting. So intuitives are always talking about light energy. Okay. They say that we are light energy, and they're always talking about light energy. And sometimes when like Laura Lynn Jackson, when she talks about connections between people, she has a book called The Light Between Us. And she says that she can, psychically see that people have these cords of light that connect them to each other. And that if you're, connected at one point in time, you're connected forever in some way. And, I remember when I read that, I thought, okay, well, can we measure this light? What kind of light is it? Why can't we measure it? Whatever. But since then, a lot of scientists have reached out to me since the book came out. And one of them was a materials scientist for the government for a long time. And he sent me all these articles on biophotons. And there's been a lot of new research showing that neurons, in addition to communicating within themselves and between neurons, they use electricity and they use chemical. So we say it's electrochemical signal. They also found that they use biophotons. They use light to communicate. This is a brand new finding.
So
Neuroscientists.
we are shining, as they say.
Exactly. And I think when you, that's brand new. That's just coming out. There's a bunch of papers, but it's not common knowledge in neuroscience yet. And I think that when you think about the words too that we use, if you just look at our language that we use, when you're happy about something, we say you're light, like the light came back to your eyes, or you're shining when you talk about this person, or whatever it is. Like, I think the language that we use says a lot about underlying things that we may not consciously be aware of. So I think that, that's why in my book, I suggested, I was like, it's so interesting what these intuitives say, the language that they use. I think that they could be hints about where to explore, what to explore. Yeah.
Scientists should take that seriously and look into it. And probably some people have always been able to see those things, to see auras or see the light that then have been, entered into the language in expressions like you're shining and came back to your eyes and all that. Now, have you seem to have vacuumed every nook and cranny of the spiritual realm in the book, but have you, I don't recall seeing you making references to some of the sources of the most ancient spiritual wisdom, like the Gnostics, what they had to say about these things, the Hermetic principles, the Sumerian tablets, the Vedic texts from India. Have you looked into those in any way?
Yeah, I read about them. I didn't go into the history of it because I felt like other books had done that really well. And then I didn't know if people would be interested. I think I mentioned the Gnostics in like a sentence, but I've listened to a lot of podcasts and read a lot about those. And I find, again, just these principles that seem to pop up over and over again across different cultures and different times in humanity as really interesting. And I think it kind of speaks to, again, our arrogance in this era to think, oh, now we have it figured out, and kind of like everyone before us was dumb. Like we give them no credit whatsoever for being able to, discern for themselves whether a ritual that they are doing works or doesn't work. And I can still step into old me and explain why that's the case, like easily, or confirmation bias, or they perceived it wrong, or like I can give the explanations. But if I step back into new me and give our ancestors a more generous runway, do we really think, and again, it's like we think people, Newton, a lot of Francis Bacon, Galileo, as I mentioned in the book, a lot of them believed in astrology. They believed in another realm. They believed in a spirit ether. So it's like, on the one hand, you give them credit for being geniuses, but except for this thing that they believed in. And it's like, if they were that smart that they could figure out all these physics, and I get it, like their technology was limited, they didn't believe in germs because they didn't have a microscope or whatever, those kinds of things. But I do think we have to give them a little more generosity. I don't think that our ancestor, I don't think that indigenous people would continue to do rituals that were fruitless, right? That didn't work for them in some way. It didn't serve some purpose. So that's what I would say about that.
Mm-hmm. When I had almost finished your book, I thought that she hasn't mentioned astrology, but then in the last chapter you do exactly that. You write about astrology, and that you dabble a little bit in that now. Do you? Or
I do.
I'm fascinated with astrology. I've been since I was a kid, really.
Yeah. So in my defense.
Yeah, you don't have to defend
I'm
anything.
just kidding.
Not here,
No,
at least.
no, yeah, astrology was interesting. It was one of the things that I really didn't pay attention to, because like most people in Western culture, I thought of the sun sign horoscopes that you read in the magazines, and those are like sometimes accurate, sometimes never. But I think that somebody recommended to me, on the journey, they're like, "Oh, I have this really great astrologer. You should get a reading." So I got a reading, and I remember that I didn't. I wasn't even worried about whether it was accurate or not. It was so psychologically insightful about myself that I was mostly focused on that for a long time. I was like, oh, I learned so much about myself from this. They do a full chart reading. So they look at the whole sky at the moment that you were born, all the planets, not just the sun sign.
No.
And I learned so much in that reading, and I was just interested. But then I didn't do anything. And then these podcasts have changed my life, I'm telling you. I randomly heard a podcast. Actually, it was Buddha at the Gas Pump. And
Oh
the
yeah, I know that
episode,
one. Rick Archer.
yeah, yeah, Rick Archer. And the episode was with Richard Tarnas, who wrote Passion of the Western Mind, which is like the entire history of Western culture, how it came to be, and then Cosmos and Psyche. And Richard Tarnas is such an impressive person in and of himself, right? He was at Harvard. He did his PhD on LSD psychotherapy. He was at Esalen, Jungian depth psychology, all that. So I listened to this episode of him say, I never believed in astrology, but I decided to, we learned about it at Esalen. I tracked it for 30 years with world events and personal charts. And then he's like, I wrote this book, Cosmos and Psyche, to summarize how and why I think astrology works. So I ordered the book immediately, and it's humongous. It's like one of the biggest books I own. And I read it in a week because I was so captivated by it. And he gave the best possible model for how these things could work. Because one of my mental problems at the point in time when I heard his podcast was, how could a palm reading and coffee grounds and an intuitive reading and astrology all tell you things about your life? And he says that it's it's basically we are a microcosm of the macrocosm, and that everything is a piece of the universe. It's like a hologram. So
holographic universe.
Yeah, holographic. So that any part, right, any subsystem of the system has all the information. And so you can use anything to get what you need. And that's how it works. And just the way that he described it finally made sense. I feel like I had heard it before, but the way that he described it, I just finally understood it. And I thought, of course, and then suddenly you don't have a need to explain exactly how the planets influencing us can tell you how your life, then those problems are just gone from your mind. And so I think that anybody who seriously, and there's a lot of scholars in astrology, like people who are very well read, who've read the ancient, Greek texts, who've spent all their time, they're like super experts on ancient Egypt and Greece, like, way smarter than me on those things. They spend their whole lives tracking and noting and documenting astrology. And I just think that that's great and interesting. And again, I think it's not enough to brush them off and say, oh, they're dumb, they're missing something.
Well, most people are brushing that off. They don't know anything about astrology, and that's it's a catch-22, because it's to them it would be unworthy to even begin studying it because it's so dumb, right?
Right.
So they can just discard it.
Yeah, and that's fine. To each their own. But for the people who do, I think it's pretty useful. I think it can tell you, give you kind of a sneak peek at like themes in your life. So
yeah, I tend to have the view that it's not really the star constellations in this case. I mean, if we talk about the 12 zodiac signs, for instance, it's not the star constellations themselves that do anything, but it's every single point in space-time. Okay, now they say that space-time is doomed, but anyway, let's assume there is a space-time. Right. Well, anyway, for all practical purposes, there is a space-time for us living in the three-dimensional world that we are now on Earth. And from this perspective, we have a universe around us. We have a solar system, and then we have a whole universe, and we have everything outside there, and every point in space-time has its own quality. That's how I see it. Every point in
Right.
space-time has its own quality.
Yeah.
And it comes back in like it's in spirals. So not two points in space-time are exactly the same. They're all unique, but they kind of rhyme, So when you come back to the same place, the same point in space-time next year, you're not exactly at the same point in space-time, but similar. And then you have similar aspects. You have similar traits.
Right.
You see what I mean?
Cycles. Yeah. I think actually something you mentioned is really important too. Another aspect to all of this that helped me eventually drop the mechanical reductionist lens that I was looking through everything was the quality of things. So and I think astrology, I don't know if it was astrology, probably. Astrology talks about the quality of time. At least Richard Tarnas, I'm sorry, what's it called? The kind he does, archetypal astrology, right? So he talks about the archetypes and how they are qualities, right? And that's what astrology is. It's like the quality to a certain time. And I think that's what Tarnas does so beautifully in his book is say, okay, these were the transits in the sky, and this is the quality of the time. So when you think about the 60s, the late 60s, right? You think about the Beatles and you think about the revolutionary vibe that was going on, the like disruption, and he's like, that's a quality to the time that's hard to measure, like with science, or like you have to come up with all these metrics and whatever, but it's like a quality to the time, and each time point, like you're saying, has a quality to it. And I think that kind of actually maps on a little bit to the consciousness debate. Like in neuroscience, there's the easy problem, which is measuring neural correlates and their activity. And then the hard problem is mapping that to our experience. And our experience is a quality, right? It's like you're experiencing the quality of the moment. It's a subjective experience of like the flavor of something, the sensation, the feeling, the experience. And those are things that are hard to measure and pinpoint and reduce and turn into mechanics. And I think that that kind of mapping and understanding that there's another dimension. So some, and some, I'm sure but for listeners, some theories of consciousness actually propose, like Descartes, the dual, like there's mind and matter. And that it kind of maps onto that. And like there's a quality that is not matter, that is phenomenal, that we cannot measure, but that we experience. And I think that's where I think like the thinking and language around astrology and some of the spiritual stuff really helps you understand that, like with the tarot too. Like if you pull a card, each card has a quality and an energy and an understanding of the wholeness of it, the holistic picture of what it's trying to convey. And again, those things are really hard to break down into pieces.
You use that as well?
Yes. I love
it. Yeah, I have a few decks here. My ex-wife gives me tarot decks sometimes, and I use them sometimes. I think it's fascinating. Especially
I love that.
Major arcana, of course, but you should. I'm not a very good reader, but I kind of do it sometimes. Yeah.
Yeah, but I think being exposed to those, right? Like that's something I would have rolled my eyes at as a scientist, but it's added.
Yeah, but you did listen to coffee ground readings.
Yeah,
so,
yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
What's more woo-woo, coffee ground readings or tarot? I mean, these cards, at least they have pictures on them, so you can interpret.
True, yeah. And that was something my mom would say, like, or that was interesting from a actually scientist mind's perspective to watch her do readings, is because she will describe qualities of things, and she'll say it's like this, and then let me think of an example. Like she would see, let's say she would see a person and she would be describing to me their personality. Like she'd like, oh, this person is assertive and, goes after what they want. And then I would say something like, oh, are they arrogant? Or, something. And she'd be like, no, it's not that. And then she would clarify the quality of what she's trying to convey. And I remember that kind of thing was hard for me to understand from a science perspective. But that's what this whole realm adds to your human experience, right? Is this whole dimension of the quality of things that you cannot reduce and break down. Like they don't make sense alone, right? It's all of it together is what makes
It's
sense.
beautifully said, and it's often like that. You sense in a way what something is, or how a person is, or how it feels, or how you intuit it, but you can't really find the words. You try to explain. I mean, much like you were describing just now. If you have this sense, this feeling of a person, you can't really put words to it. You just, I don't know.
Right.
It's just, I mean,
No,
it's like that all
yeah.
the time, and it's
There's this book, it's by a psychotherapist, I think it's called Focusing, but it does that. It's like this activity where he's like, you sit, you clear your mind, you think of a person that you know, and you just feel like the whole sense of them. And he's like, you don't break it down into he's smart, he's tall, he has blue eyes, he has it. You don't do that. He's kind, he's creative. He's like, you don't do that. You just have a sense of the person. And that's, I think,
exactly. And I mean,
yeah.
yeah, I mean, talking about people who are very much in love, or who have a very loving and good relationship, that's exactly how it is for these, I mean, couples. We all know about that. I mean, we have such a relationship, we're in such a relationship ourselves, or we know people who are, and they don't have to define the other person.
Right,
They don't define
exactly.
them. They just sense who they are.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. It's like you might love all these things about them, but a lot of times you just love them.
If it's
The
unconditional, it's
whole.
you don't put it in words. You just
Yeah.
accept. So we've been talking for a long time, and you might not believe this, but I have like 10 or 12 more questions. But I knew that I wouldn't be able to ask them all. I would love to do this again if it's possible at some point.
Mhm.
Uh,
That'd be
but
great.
just finally talking about your worldview a little bit here. After realizing that there is a whole world that conventional science says virtually nothing about, do you suspect that the scientific community is similarly biased in other areas, other quote unquote controversial areas? Might be, climate, health, human origins, what do I know, all kinds of things. Have you started suspecting that, or do you leave that aside and focus on these
Um,
matters?
I haven't really thought about that. I mean, I think that,
Since you
you
discovered that this is an area that's actually been shunned by conventional science, maybe
yeah.
there are other areas that are also shunned. I don't know.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I think you hear that with people like Graham Hancock talks about
Oh yeah,
archaeology in
yeah.
that
Mm.
way. Like, I would never have been aware of that if he didn't talk about that. But and I don't know anything about archaeology or the field of archaeology. I don't know, but it's not hard for me to understand and believe what he's
What's going
saying
on? Yeah.
because it is true. I mean, a lot of times it's not nefarious. I do think people think it's like nefarious or planned, and it's really
Mm.
not. It's really
Mm.
just like that's how you're trained, that's what you believe. You're too
Habit.
busy to look outside of what you're doing, and you don't have time for it. You're like, you have no energy or time to deal with it. So I mean, I don't think it's nefarious, but yeah, of course. I think science is funded in the United States is funded by the NIH, the National Institute of Health, and the National Science Foundation, and those are funded by the U.S. government, which like each year they decide where the budget goes. So where they decide the budget goes is what gets studied.
Mm.
So of
Vested
course it's
interests.
biased.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, and like the other money that comes is from rich foundations, so it's whatever Zuckerberg or Sam, whoever's rich, Bill Gates, those foundations also fund science, but it's whatever they're interested in.
Mm.
So of course
Follow
it's
the money.
biased. Yeah.
Okay. Well, great. That's maybe another conversation, but it's kind of interesting to hear your thoughts on that. I
Yeah.
was
I
thinking
don't think it's
maybe other doors
nefarious,
had
but
opened up in your mind that maybe it's not as I've been told in this area and that area. Anyway.
I do think one thing I would say, I do think unfortunately, just because of the way science works, it does have a self-perpetuating problem. I talk about this in the book. I don't think innovation is rewarded, even though they always claim that innovation is. It's not. When you write a grant, you have to be so careful to toe the line between previous research and a new thing that you're proposing. So true innovation is not rewarded in
Mm-hmm.
science. It's incremental. And so in that way, it's hard for people. You have to work within the system you're given, right? Like scientists don't even make that much money to begin with. So like you're trying to work within this system that you're in, and it's not easy because they have to do really silly proposals that like move just a little bit further, but don't shock the reviewers who are going to be like, where are you making this claim? Please cite all the research that made you think that this was an acceptable thing to propose, so there's a lot of bureaucracy, of
So
course,
maybe
like
then,
everything else.
in order to get somewhere, it's necessary to have these mavericks that we have out there who come
We
up with.
need big money to fund people who want to be innovative, and it's not going to happen from the government foundations. It's just not going to happen. They're too slow, and there's not enough money to be reckless with it. So there's a call like for patrons to come forward to fund people who want to do really innovative research. I mean, that's what's needed to have breakthroughs.
You were talking about your view on the media, the role of the media in this context.
Yeah, I think I mean, I think in general, scientists are not trained to speak. I mean, I know this. We are not trained to speak to the media. It's really funny. I have a friend who works in Hollywood, and I told him this once, and he never stopped laughing about it. But I said, in graduate school, they give us like a one sheet that says how to talk to journalists. And it's like has bullet points, and that's all the media training you ever get. And then scientists like are, to get respect, we talk in jargon and long, complicated sentences. So when we speak to journalists, it's like freaking disaster. They always end up having like one usable quote from you because the rest was jargon. And I remember thinking about this in regards to this spiritual stuff. It's just so interesting because there's definitely a bias in the media because it's a bias in Western mainstream culture against things that are just not accepted by the worldview, materialism. And I think I've been, ever since this quote unquote awakening or whatever, my flip, I read articles really carefully. I read the words they use really carefully because I'm like, isn't journalism supposed to be objective? But it's not. Like a
It's
lot of
not.
New York Times articles I read, which I love the New York Times, but they use all kinds of biased words when they're talking about like Reiki or I don't know, energy healing or gurus or shamans or whatever. They always they'll alleged or whatever. They use kind of words that make it like it's a slight nudge, but it's a nudge. It's a bias. And I remember thinking it would just be so nice, or we need more people who are trained in fields like science and other fields to write, to do writing, because we understand that, like, I think also a lot of things that are lost in journalistic pieces that I read are the nuance, which is important. They want everything simplified. And there are ways to explain the nuance in simple ways, but they usually just cut the nuance out. And I think that that's a problem. I think that I understand that we think the public is stupid, but like we can't continue in this way. Like people have to understand that biology and life and reality is nuanced. And I don't think we should, I think there's ways to communicate. I think so much work needs to be put into communication on both sides. It's a real shame. But yeah, there needs to be more actually unbiased publications.
I agree, and there's no reason to believe that this is the only area where the media is biased.
No, no. There's a lot of bias. Yeah, I'm really keenly aware of it now when I read things, and it's a shame. This is why I said what I said about either we need experts to be able to write, journalistically, or at least have the journalists work more closely with the experts, is because, so let's say you have an article on, I don't know, like let's say energy healing. What I have found in the last year as I read these articles, you'll basically the journalist will ask experts who have not necessarily check the literature, right? So they might ask like a physician, an MD, to be like, is there any evidence for Reiki healing, or I'm just using that as an example, but a subtle energy. And the doctor, who again, physicians and scientists love being experts. We do not like telling people we don't know things, even when we don't. So usually, unfortunately, it's a human personality trait, a left hemisphere brain thing, that I will create an answer for you and with authority, and certainly tell you, because I think it must be true, right? Because all of my colleagues seem to think that this has been studied and debunked. So I'm going to tell this reporter, oh yeah, there's no evidence for subtle energy healing to work. So then the journalist goes and publishes it. Meanwhile, not a single person related to this article has searched the scientific literature. And then it turns out there actually is evidence for it. And I see a lot of that in science reporting in the media. And I think that that's a huge problem. And that's what I found when I did my book, was you read all these articles and you'll hear journalists say, well, there's no evidence for psychic phenomena. That's been studied and debunked. But you know what? That's not true. That whole sentence is not true. So
I know. And you also point out that when they say that, which often happens, there's no evidence for that. There's no evidence for that. That often means that it hasn't been investigated even.
Exactly. And that one really gets under my skin, because they say it all the time. There's no evidence for that. That is not, because people who read it take it as it's been studied and there was no evidence. But usually it means this has not been studied, so therefore there is no evidence. But it's disingenuous to say that, because it's misleading. It misleads the public. Instead, they should be honest about it and be like, this has not been investigated. This has not been funded by enough people. There have not been enough studies to definitively say one way or another. That, I don't, yeah. Do you know why they do that? Why do they do that? They really shouldn't do that.
There's so much bias. I mean, journalists are just people, and scientists are people, and we have all these flaws.
That's true. Yeah.
Flaws, but it's good to see it clearly and to see what is going on, so that you can, read between the lines, as it were.
Yes. Yeah. It's important. Yeah, to be aware. But that's something I've noticed, and that's why I called it out in the book, because I just thought it was so. I saw it happening a lot, especially with COVID. Like, I would have just read a scientific article, and then I would read something in the New York Times, and then they would say, "There's been no evidence for that," and I'd be like, "Wait a minute."
Suspicious.
It's like, yeah, and again, it's not usually. I'm assuming not nefarious. It's just that nobody bothered to search, Google Scholar, and they're not trained to read the articles.
Right.
So that's why it's important for the experts to work closely with journalists.
Yeah. Mona, it's been fantastic to have this conversation with you. Are you working on the second book, or what are your plans right now?
Yeah, I'm sort of collecting notes,
okay.
ideas. But yeah, I write a newsletter on psychedelics and altered states and the transpersonal and everything weird. You can find that on Substack. It's called The Brave New World of Psychedelic Science. It's all also on my website, which is just my name. It's monasobhaniphd.com. Yes. And a collaborator and I are creating a few, we have to plan them, but we're doing a few science and spirituality retreats. So we'll be announcing those soon.
So is that website where people should go if they want to know more about you and your work? The website you mentioned there?
Yes, yeah. Everything's there.
Okay, I'll put a link in the description, of course. monasobhani.com or .org?
.com.
.com, okay. So good luck with your continued quest to bridge science and spirituality now, and thank you for being a guest on the show.
Thank you so much for having me. It was really fun.